The difference is when somebody else uses those laws, nobody writes about it. When I use it, they say, oh, Trump, Trump, Trump.
The country's going bankrupt. If we don't take action, the entire government budget will be paying interest. There won't be money for anything. That's where we're headed. That's what bankruptcy means.
For God's sake, Trump, Elon, you think you're making the economy better, you're going to cause it to crash.
America will be fine. You add it all up, by 2035, you have over 74 trillion in debt.
Numbers that conventional economists say should have no impact on the economy at all. In fact, that's what drives the booms and busts of the economy.
The influential contrarian economist, Steve Keen.
Brilliant economist that criticizes much of modern economics.
The research fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at University College in London.
He is someone that each and every one of us has to listen to, whether we agree or disagree.
Here's Steve Keen.
Well, you'd need to be living under a rock not to know that one major objective of the Trump-Musk American government is to reduce the government deficit preferably to zero. And it is currently running at about $2 trillion a year. They hope to cut about $1 trillion of spending this year and ultimately cut out government spending so much that it will be no further deficit. There'll be a balanced budget or preferably even a surplus. And this is Musk explaining why he sees it as necessary on Joe Rogan recently.
He's going bankrupt. If we don't take action, we're dollar's going to be worth nothing. And the interest payments, which are already 23% of 23% of all government income, income taxes, tariffs, and everything, is just going to pay interest right now. And that number is continually rising. So if we don't do something, the entire government budget will be paying interest. There won't be money for anything. No, there won't be money for Social Security. There won't be money for Medicare, nothing. That's where we're headed. That's what bankruptcy means.
And the same attitude is held by politicians, of course. This is a Republican senator on the floor of the Congress.
I need to explain why is there such angst? So I'm the idiot with all the economists. I'm number 4 in Ways and Means. I'm not good at many things in life. I'm okay at math. What's going on that is stressing us? Last night I could barely sleep because I had read report after report after report. Here's our reality. And forgive us, we've been going as fast as we can in our office to find some way to explain what the hell's going on. Into this budget year, United States debt by Congressional Budget Office is projected to be $37.2 trillion. They're projecting over the next 10 years, we add another $20 trillion. You add it all up, by 2035, you have over 74 trillion in debt. You're somewhere in the 155 or so % of the entire economy is borrowed. Today, we're a little less than 100. U.S. sovereign debt that was held by the public was around 28 trillion. These numbers right now say that number that took, 240 years of publicly held debt, we intend to double in 9 years. This is my 4-minute spiel. When you see some of us stressing out, when you see some of us, he's being disharmonious. Maybe it's because I own a damn calculator.
Now, the same case is made by prominent economists. This is Jeffrey Sachs.
We also have a range of financial issues which are pretty complicated. The United States has taken on so much public debt in the last 30 years because both our political parties like to give tax cuts and like to make spending increases, even though maybe on somewhat different things. Both parties have been agents of deficits and debt accumulation. So our debt held by the public is about 100% of GDP, but it's going to soar in the coming years.
And the textbooks equally teach the same ideas. So this is Gregory Mankiw's macroeconomic text, probably the most popular macro textbook on the planet these days. And he argues here that the most direct way in which government affects national saving is through public saving. And this is the difference between what the government receives in tax revenue and what it spends. When its spending exceeds its revenue, on the other hand, the government runs a budget deficit, which is negative public saving. And a budget deficit raises interest rates and crowds out private sector investment. But the resulting reduction in the capital stock is part of the burden of national debt on future generations. Now, if on the other hand, if it spends less than it raises in revenue, then it runs a surplus, and it can use that surplus to retire government debt and also to stimulate private sector investment. Now, that's the argument about the government's role. In terms of how the banks are supposed to function or the monetary system works, textbooks teach what they call the model of loanable funds. And saving by households is a supply of loanable funds. So households put some of their money into an account which is lent out by banks, or they lend directly to firms. Firms, on the other hand, they do the borrowing. Either they borrow directly from households or they borrow through the banking sector. And the increase in government spending, if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, then that causes interest rates to rise and investment falls. So government purchases are said to crowd out investment by the private sector. Now, this is how it's represented in textbooks. They use supply and demand diagrams to show what they think is going on. And without a government deficit, Mankiw shows this particular supply and demand diagram. So he has a fixed supply of savings. Now, that's how textbooks explain it. Of course, banks don't use supply and demand diagrams. They use double entry bookkeeping. To understand that, you have to understand assets, liabilities, and equity. So I'll give a simple example to start with. Imagine that Donald Trump needs a bit of a break from the White House, so he strolls out to the local McDonald's and buys a hamburger. Okay? Well, you can show the transactions through the banking system in terms of double entry bookkeeping, just using a spreadsheet for that hypothetical transaction. So Donald Trump's bank account will fall by $5 and McDonald's bank account will rise by $5. Now, I've developed a software package that enables the double entry bookkeeping to be done at the national level. It's called Revelation, or Revel, pardon. It's called Revelation on the website there. Its name is Ravel. And this is what we call a godly table, showing exactly the same operation as I've shown there by a spreadsheet. So, you can do with a spreadsheet what you can do with Ravel at that level. But if you want to show the full system, you actually need not one table, but 5 tables. You first of all need a table for the Fed, because the Fed has to transfer reserves from the bank that Trump banks with, which is Axos Bank, to the bank that McDonald's banks with, which is TD Bank. So it has to transfer reserves from one bank to the other. And you need another 2 tables for the 2 banks involved. So Axos Bank, where Trump banks, and TD, where McDonald's banks. And then what happens in this transaction is the assets and the liabilities of Axos Bank fall, the assets and the liabilities of TD Bank rise. And then for the individual level, you need 2 tables, one for Trump and one for McDonald's. And in the case of for Trump's point of view, his financial net worth falls by $5, but he gets the hamburger. The financial worth of McDonald's rises by $5, which is why they sold the hamburger. So this is the 5 tables that you need to do to see that complete transaction. And that you can't do in a spreadsheet, or you'd be working bloody hard to do it. It's quite straightforward to do that in Ravel, because it maintains that link between different tables, because what's an asset for one sector or entity in the model is a liability for the other, and it uses that to make a complete vision of what's actually going on financially. Now, you can get Ravel for free from this particular link here on the Patreon site through which we distribute Ravel. That'll give you a free copy of the program itself, and you also get the files that I'm putting together in this presentation here. Now, to show that, what I want to do is model that model of loanable funds in Ravel. And to do that, I've got the 5 tables that are necessary already set up in this version of Ravel for loanable funds. So I have the banks table, households, firms, treasury, and the Fed. So let's start modeling it by going to the banking sector table. And I'll just make it full screen here and make it a bit larger. So one asset that banks have is reserves. That's their accounts at the central bank, the Fed for Americans, of course. And we then have to have firms having deposit accounts at the bank, at the private banks, households, and they're the ones who do the saving and the lending in the model of loanable funds, and then the government as well. And the secret that Ravel uses to make the model of the financial system is that assets minus liabilities are equal to your equity. Now, the bank's not doing anything in the system so far, because according to the model of loanable funds, which is taught by economic textbooks, banks are intermediaries. So they don't actually do the lending. They enable somebody else to lend, the borrower. And they, of course, the only way an intermediary can make money out of that is they charge a fee. Now, of course, debt was not in the bank's table. If you take a look again at that table, you'll see if there was debt is not there, because the debt is an asset of the lender, not of the intermediary. So I've got to create an extra column here and say we have debt of firms. I'll use debt _F to save time here. And that, of course, is the money flows out of the household accounts to the firms. The households keeping track of the fact that the firms now owe them that money. So that increases the amount of the value of the asset of debt of firms owed to households. Now, everything else happens here. I've got the government as well, so I've got to create another column for the government here. So debt of the government sector, and of course borrowing by the government reduces the bank balance of the households, but increases the debt the government owes to households. So that row is now correct. Everything else, consuming by households, just like the hamburger example I used for Trump earlier, paying a fee to banks, interest from firms, interest from government, taxation and wages, they all affect the net worth, the equity of the household sector. And I've got a little command in Ravel where if I right-click inside the equity column, I can choose balance equity, and it brings all those operations across in one go. Now, so we've got the households done. Let's now do the other elements of the system. So we have firms here. Okay, and then the same story. If I zoom down on assets, there's just two left, firms and government. So there are the operation for the firm sector. Now, they owe money to the households. So the debt of the firms is a liability of the firm sector. That brings across the borrowing operation. However, here I've got the firm's net worth. I'll call this firm's equity. And everything else here affects their equity. So consumption by households increases the net worth of firms. That's like McDonald's getting $5 from Trump for the hamburger. So the government trying to get into positive equity drives the remainder of the economy into negative equity. And then people speculate on asset prices. You get a boom and you get a bust, as we saw in the 1920s, as we saw in the 1990s. So Trump's and Musk's cuts could have the same impact. They are not intelligent. They're being done by people who have not properly modeled the system in which we're in. Get a copy of Ravel, for God's sake, Trump, Elon, and work out what the hell's going on. You think you're making the economy better, you're going to cause it to crash. Now, it's fine. I'm a great fan of what you're doing with SpaceX. I'm probably even more than you. I want to see a human outpost on Mars. Okay? Desperately want to see that happen. But what you're doing in rocket design, you make one rocket, it crashes, you build another, you've got a production line churning them out. You can make mistakes with each individual rocket because there's another one coming out of the factory. You only have one economy. If you crash that, your ambitions for Mars are going to crash with it. Stop trying to cut the deficit.
If you're like many other truth seekers and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to apply.stevekeinfree.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to apply.stevekeinfree.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.